Take it away.
Thank you, Jim. Also want to thank Adam too. He introduced basically the topic perfectly. It makes 100% sense to put heifers on pasture, pretty much in every way you could possibly think. So I am going to walk you through a demo we did with CAFO in northeastern Wisconsin. This demo was done after they've done the conversion to a pasture system for their heifers. But obviously the tool is a what if tool, a comparison tool to see, what if I were to take this land with these heifers, does that work out? And is that better than what I'm doing right now? So this is the pasture heifer balance. The first sheet, one thing before I get started, just to help this make sense, the light gray cells or boxes, those are input cells. Light green boxes are output cells or cells that we calculate for you. And then your dark green boxes are your headers for your columns and your rows. Obviously, you don't put input anything in there. So first things first, in the pasture heifer balance, we look to see, does the land that you are interested in using in pasture, or a user or farmer is interested in using in pasture, would that meet the dry matter demand of their heifer herd? So first thing you got to do in this first step, step 1.1, is to define your pasture areas of interest. We use areas of interest as terminology because that's what's used in the web soil survey from the NRCS. And basically it's just a plot of land, and you can split up your plot of lands based on either what you were using the land for, or the major characteristics of the land. Say you have a field that has a steep slope compared to a flat field, you would obviously want to separate those two. So first you put in the acres of each area of interest, and then your existing land use for each area of interest as well. Then you need to either find the dominant soil type of your areas of interest, which you can go to the web soil survey. The link is right there, or the forage suitability group that goes along with your areas of interest as well. If, as a service provider, you don't know much about the land of the farmer that we are talking about, or you are talking to, please go through and actually find the dominant soil type, each areas of interest, because then you would do the next step, which is step 1.3. And this is made possible by an app, the Pasture Prediction Yield app, that was made by a fellow member of the Grassland 2.0 project. This app is amazing. All you need to do is input your dominant soil type and the county, and then you'll get a table of your dry matter per acre per season that could be made off of that land as pasture. And the table is then ranged by a low, medium, or high yielding variety grass, and is ranged by occupancy period. So as you can see in the tables in 1.3, you have a different productivity based on your occupancy period. Thus, following basic managed grazing theory, the more you move your animals, the more you will get off of your land. So either you go find your soil type, use the app, and get an estimate of what your pasture productivity could be for the farmer, or you have a pretty good context going in and you know the forage suitability group that also corresponds with a certain productivity of dry matter per acre per season. So in this case, we did do step 1.3. We found those two tables of productivity, and then we use them to find out actually the utilization of the pasture. Utilization is different than growth because not everything that is grown will get eaten by the animals. Kind of silly to think so. But if you did step 1.3, you would select your occupancy period, the type of species that goes along with each area of interest. And then we, in the predictive productivity column, we compute basically what your productivity per acre per season in tons of dry matter. Then just a quick timeout. If you didn't do step 1.3 and you do have a good context or you know the forage suitability group of soil, you can actually just input your own productivity figure in the estimated productivity column that would overwrite anything previously. But that is only, you should do that if you have a good guess or a good contextual reason to know what the productivity of that farm will be. So then, either with the predicted productivity from step 1.3 or your own productivity, we have a weighted average per acre. We then apply a residual or a target residual that would make sense with your productivity measure. If you use the app in step 1.3, that would be about 20 to 30% because of the way the data was, the way that the data informs the tool, that's the number that makes sense. But if you have your own productivity measure in the estimated productivity, please put a number that makes sense with that. If you already were factoring in residual, put 0% there. If you were already thinking graze half, leave half, put 50% there. That's more of a judgment call. So now we know the tons of dry matter per season in utilization. So that's actually what is available for animals to eat in the total pasture utilization. Next, we look at actually the animals. In step 1.5, you go through and basically go down the list and fill it out to what makes sense with your heifer herd, large or small breed, typically brown cow small, white cow large in very layman terms. But if you really are unsure, just go large as a cautious measure. And then are the heifers bred or unbred? In this case, they were unbred. How many heifers? What was their average beginning weight going into the grazing season? I'm actually going to take another timeout real quick. This entire sheet, this entire module for Excel, we are comparing the grazing season and only the heifer enterprise. We don't want to try to make any kind of assumptions or any kind of comparisons that would factor in other things because simply we are not asking the right questions for that. But we are asking the perfect questions for the grazing season and the heifer enterprise. Time back in, then you would select your target daily weight gain. We have a drop-down box of acceptable pounds per day that are healthy for a heifer to put on. In this case, we chose 1.76. And then how many days on pasture your farmer is willing to work. Then we can calculate how much dry matter will be demanded per head per day, and then for the grazing season for the entire heifer herd. That number, in this case, was about 600 tons of dry matter, then compared to the 1,155 tons of pasture feed available. In this case, obviously 1,155 is much bigger than 600. You actually will return excess pasture with this kind of pasture plan. That's okay because this user wants to use that excess pasture for hay. And then the pasture sufficiency ratio to the right, basically what would make a pasture plan sufficient is if it was about 120%, meaning that we are planning that extra 20% of dry matter just in case there's, a dry month or extra wet month or an asteroid hits your pasture. I'm not sure, but we want to have a little bit of a buffer room in there. And that's also kind of what the residual does as well. So basically, we're making a pretty cautious pasture plan, knowing that if you are sufficient or in excess, this probably will very much work for you going forward. You can also input any kind of supplemental feed in this initial part of the pasture plan. This is so if you put a large amount of supplemental feed, that will reduce the amount of pasture your animals eat. But if it is a small percent of high energy feed, it probably won't move any pasture demand at all. So just to make sure you guys are paying attention, I'm going to come back around and basically say the main points of every sheet. The main point of the pasture heifer balance is to see if the available land can support the dry matter demand of the heifer herd. And we saw that was very much feasible and actually in very much excess. So now we're going to see if a feeding plan based off this pasture, does that make sense for the animal performance that you're looking for in your heifer herd? So up top, we have the NRC nutrient and energy recommendations. This is from the latest NRC publication, and based on the heifer herd size, breed, pregnancy status, and target daily gain, that is that is the nutrient loadout that a heifer should hit on a daily basis to make sure that they can actually reach that average daily gain. We compare that to 100% pasture feeding plan, because previously in last sheet, they selected to do no supplementation. So we're going to assume 100% pasture then. And this pasture nutrient profile comes from the Dairy One Feed Library. It's an average of over 14,000 different pasture samples. We use this because people probably don't have a pasture sample at this point when they're planning the what if, the is this possible? So this is a very average number. Most pastures, if well managed, are actually quite better than this. But say, we'll assume the average at least. In this case, your most vital nutrients, your total digestible nutrients, the TDN, the net energy maintenance, NEM, and net energy growth are all good. They all get checked off in the evaluation check. And in fact, the only thing that's low is metabolic energy. And that's okay because it's really iffy to calculate metabolic energy. It's a lot less of a concrete number compared to the first two energies. So if you have the first three nutrients, you're pretty much good to go. So in this case, they're good to go. That being said, you can also implement any supplements, any mineral, anything that's not like an energy source or a protein source. You could put that in below that just as an economic consideration. Plus, if you see that you're low on calcium or phosphorus and you supplement with the mineral mix with calcium or phosphorus, you can obviously like ignore that. So going forward, what have we done so far? We saw that a plot of land can support the heifer herd in a volume sense. And then we saw that if that land is average at best, that would still meet the healthy development for the heifer herd. So next, we kind of gotten the green lights to say, okay, this pasture plan actually makes some sense. Let's see what kind of figures come with that. So we're going to go to the pasture establishment and annual operating costs. There's basically two ways that this sheet could work. You can either enter in per acre estimates for pasture establishment, fencing, and a watering system, or you can go the long way, as we say, and enter in detailed information about the same exact stuff. In this case, since this is a big farm and we're just looking for basically a guesstimate or a rough guess for how much that establishment would be, we opted to do the per acre option. And this is, as a specialist, since you guys do have a good context of what these kind of things cost, or maybe even what they cost in certain areas of Wisconsin, you would go ahead and most likely use this per acre short form. But if you're completely clueless, go through the long form. It's pretty much the same thing. It's just asking you the exact specifics of all of these cost measures. We go through each area of interest, step 1, 2, and 3 for the pasture establishment costs, which is like your ecological, your fertility, your conversion really of the land. And as you can see, the existing grassland had less of a conversion cost than conversion from hay or row crop. And then we go through the fencing. Fencing is pretty similar for both areas of interest, and same with the watering system. But in both of these, we would like you to put useful life of both systems or both infrastructures. This is so we can get a depreciation figure. As we are economists, we're looking for the true economic cost. And it really is up to how well the user or the farmer can, maintain and repair the systems over time. Typically, it's just the amount of years it would take you to then have to completely replace the system. That's what you should put for useful life. So we have the main pasture establishment costs laid out, and then any other equipment related costs, any kind of equipment that you need to get to run this pasture system that they already don't have. You want to put in the price that they would pay for that, like the market price, uh, the useful life, same idea there. And then we have the column that says percent use for heifers. This is so we don't accidentally apply depreciation that would belong to other parts of the farm towards the heifer system. So this is kind of a subjective guess, but if you know that you're only going to use an ATV for your grazing your heifers, put 100% there. If you think about half the time, you'll use it for other stuff, put 50% there. That's kind of a subjective guess, but we add up the new equipment costs there, all of the pasture establishment costs that we calculated before, and then we have a total upfront cost for the heifer grazing system. As you can see, that's a pretty freaking big number, 189,500. To be fair, this is a very, very large farm system, and all of this has no financial assistance calculated into it. We understand that National Resource Conservation has the EQIP program. There are county, state, and federal grants available, and yeah. So basically, yeah. So this number is not 100% concrete, but those things kind of vary depending on your situation. So we don't really apply them right now. So we've gone through, saw that the land can support the volume of feed the heifers need. That feed made sense for the heifer's healthy development. So then we calculate the establishment costs. Now to calculate the operating expense. So for step 3.5, this is your labor expense. This is normal, reoccurring operating labor expense. So any kind of one-time custom hires, please do not put in step 3.5. This in the grazing system is really kind of just feeding or moving fence or repairing fence. This you would have to have a conversation with the user, but you input your daily labor and then you split it up between owner labor or hired labor. And if you have hired labor, you have to put an hourly rate to assign to that hired labor. And then we have the total hired labor during the grazing season, basically just multiplying and adding that up. In step 3.6, we have any kind of direct cash expense that would be incurred in the operating of the pasture during the grazing season. We reiterate hired labor, but then you put things in there like seed, fertility, any kind of custom hires, rent, basically your others when it comes to expense. And then you have your non-cash expense, which we have is owner labor and depreciation. Depreciation we calculate from above, and then owner labor you can assign hourly wage that you can want to give yourself. Since this isn't a direct cost that time is everyone can value their time differently. This isn't really included in the direct comparison of cash expense, but it is good to have that in mind, basically to see how much time and how much money per se the owner would be putting towards a grazing system. And then we have the labor, we have the establishment, we have any kind of extra expense, and then any kind of feed that would be not from pasture. So if you chose to have supplemental feed, this would pop up as well. But in this case, we only had those minerals and salt lick from before. So you just input your price per pound. And if you had supplemental feed, you would input your price or your cost to grow, depending if you bought it or grew it. And then we basically add up this non-pasture feed expense with all of your normal recurring operating expense. And we get that number to the right, 82,725 in this example. And just to reiterate, that is cash expense for the heifers during the grazing season. So we have determined the operating expense and labor expense during the grazing season. We see that this pasture plan makes sense. Let's compare it to what are you doing now? This answer is very easy for this demonstration because um, in this case, they used to actually send their heifers off to somebody else to be raised. And basically, there's two options for the sheet. Either my heifers are raised by somebody else, which is what we have right here, or you used to raise your heifers. You raise your heifers on your farm. Then you would go through basically your feeding plan, and then labor, and then operating expense, very similar to the last sheet, uh, basically because a lot of farmers actually don't know exactly how much how much time and how much money and how much feed exactly that they spend towards their heifers. So we had to make that number up for them so we can compare. But in this case, it's very easy. They used to just have their heifers raised by somebody else. So you put in your total cost for raising, any kind of transportation costs. So basically your contract. And then how many days those heifers are off your farm. We do that so we can get a cost per head per day that is equivalent or is comparable for the grazing season. And this number is actually comparable for the grazing season and not the grazing season. But like I keep on saying, we're only comparing the grazing season. So we basically have everything we need to make a financial comparison of the existing heifer raising strategy compared to this proposed pasture plan. Yeah, and this is just to make sure you've been following along. We've checked that the pasture plan makes sense, calculated how much it would cost for you to start and run this pasture plan, and then how much is it costing you right now to do what you're doing. So it's time to compare. So just a quick timeout. As a junior economist, we went and we are looking at economic costs. So economic cost is cash plus depreciation plus opportunity cost. First thing we compare is cash, because this is the most real, the most tangible expense. So we have the cash cost of the pasture system establishment, we have the cash cost of the operating expense of the pasture system during the grazing season, and then the cash cost of either your operating expense on farm, in this case, $0, or cash expense of having your heifers raised by somebody else. And in this case, that pops up. So you can see right away, there's a pretty big discrepancy in the cash cost in total and cost per head per day, over $1 difference from the pasture system to a contracted heifer raising system. And granted that these are old numbers because they used to have their heifers raised a couple of years ago now. You'd be very lucky to get $2.35 per head per day these days with everything going on. So anyways, we compared the cash. Now we're going to find out the opportunity costs. Basically, the way that we would find the opportunity cost is to see how much, basically, if you have any excess hay that you could get off pasture, that would actually help to discount your opportunity cost. In this case, that they really have planned for, harvesting about 300 tons of extra hay per year. So that would equate to about an extra $45,000 that they wouldn't have to spend on hay for their farm. The next section is operated land opportunity costs. And in this case, we look at the amount of land that you took out of cropland, basically trying to attribute any kind of lost feed from that cropland to the rest of the farm. And in this case, about $58,000 of lost feed. So in true, to find the true opportunity cost, it's really that 58,000 minus the 45,000. Plus any rented land opportunity costs. This would be if you own the land and you were previously renting it out, then then we would want to account for that too. In this case, they actually were renting the land themselves, so they didn't have any lost rental income. So now we have cash, opportunity costs, and depreciation. We can make the total economic comparison. And we look at the pasture system in the steady state versus the existing system. and it's very favorable to the pasture system. So you can see the $2.35 per head per day pales in comparison to the $1.38 per head per day in the pasture system. And yeah, it's a cost savings of about $1 per head per day. And we say steady state because we are assuming that those productivities we were talking about before, those management costs we were talking about before, basically everything to do with the pasture, we were thinking it as an already developed, well-managed pasture. Obviously, there's going to be a learning curve if farmers never done pasture before. So this next part is where we try to basically factor in this learning curve. We have a little survey, and based on your level of experience, how much time you're willing to put in, and when you're going to seed your pasture, we will basically knock off a certain amount of productivity from your pasture, and then you would have to replace that productivity with extra feed. In this case, we're seeing in that first year that you might have an extra $5,000–6,000 in feed costs to cover up of your lack of productivity. So we factor this back in, and then we can compare the steady state, the well-managed, fully developed pasture, to what would probably be in your first grazing season for this specific example. And you can see that there's a bit of a bump up in cost per head per day, but it's still favorable to the existing strategy. And you know that you might start off at $2 per head per day, but you can make it down to $1.30. So basically, we wrap this up really nice in part 5, and you have a full printable summary. This prints off easy into a nice page, and we look at economic costs per head per day, and then basically your cost savings, which is about $1 per head per day. In this case, since it's such a large farm, that turns into $74,000 per season. So that initial investment of 190 grand about, if you are good and if you are inept at converting to a pasture system, it should take you less than 3 grazing seasons just by cost savings to recoup that. And then if you really struggle, say it takes you 2 years of bad seasons to really get it down, it would take you about 6 seasons to fully recoup your initial investment. And that's with no financial assistance, nothing like that. We're just talking about your cost savings that we can calculate right now. And then we also talk through the labor. Excuse me. And in this system, obviously there's actually going to be more labor in the grazing system compared to the custom heifers, simply because you're paying somebody else to do the labor for you. So in this case, we compare that basically just to, drive home, basically the labor outcome of making this transition. So yeah, that pretty much wraps it up. We go through the pasture plan, we see if it makes sense, we see how much it would cost to set up, how much it would cost to run, compare that to what you're doing right now, and time again, you're going to see results like this.